A normal house is supposed to sit on the ground. You walk through the front door. The living room is right there. The garage is right there. Everything starts at street level. But drive through parts of Louisiana and that logic completely disappears. You will see a colorful house sitting 10 feet in the air. A staircase leads up to what looks like the second floor. Cars are parked underneath it. Sometimes there is nothing under the home except giant concrete columns, water, and empty space. At first, it looks ridiculous. Like someone built the house, forgot the ground floor, then just decided to leave it that way. But those columns are not there because Louisiana homeowners wanted a better view. They are there because, in the worst moments, the ground underneath the house is supposed to stop being ground. It is supposed to become part of the water. And the home survives by letting that happen. Because in a place where water can rise through streets, yards, garages, and entire neighborhoods, the safest thing a house can do is get out of the way. This is why Louisiana houses look like they are floating. The house with no first floor. Imagine buying a house and being told the first floor cannot actually be a floor. You can use the space underneath for parking. You can put stairs there. You can store a few things if local rules allow it. But when a flood comes, you cannot treat it like a normal room. You cannot build a nice bedroom underneath. You cannot put your family room there. You cannot turn it into a finished apartment and pretend the flood does not exist. Because the second you put valuable living space where floodwater wants to go, you are basically challenging the water to a fight. And water does not care how expensive your drywall was. That is the weird thing about these raised Louisiana homes. The empty space underneath is not wasted space. It is sacrificial space. It is the part of the property that is allowed to flood, so the part where people actually live does not. That sounds simple. Just put the house higher, but it completely changes how the building works. A normal home uses its lower walls to keep everything outside. Wind stays outside, rain stays outside, the ground stays outside. But a raised house in a flood zone is built around a different idea. When the water gets high enough, do not trap it. Do not try to hold it back with a weak wall. Let it pass through underneath the home. Keep the actual living floor above the water. That is why the thumbnail looks so crazy. The house is not floating because it is barely attached to the ground. It is floating because the part you normally think of as the house has been lifted above the level where disaster happens. And down below, where a garage or living room would normally be, there is just air, or floodwater, or both. Why the ground is the problem. The real issue is not that Louisiana has water. Every state has rain, every state has rivers, every state has storms. The problem is that large parts of Louisiana have a very bad combination of things happening at once: heavy rain, low land, rivers, wetlands, storm surge, hurricanes, floodplains, and in some places, water that has nowhere to disappear quickly when everything gets overwhelmed. A normal house can handle rain because rain usually hits the roof, runs into gutters, moves through the yard, and eventually drains away. That is the normal deal. But during a serious flood, that deal is over. The yard becomes a shallow lake. The road becomes a channel. The driveway becomes part of the flood. And suddenly, the lowest part of the home is sitting directly in the path of moving water. Now think about what happens to a normal one-story house. The water hits the doors, then the garage, then the drywall, then the outlets, then the appliances, then the flooring. Then everything the family owns. And even if the house does not collapse, it can be destroyed from the inside. The worst part is that floodwater is not clean water. It can carry mud, fuel, sewage, chemicals, debris, insects, and whatever else was sitting in a city or neighborhood before the storm came through. Once that gets inside, you are not just drying a carpet, you are tearing out walls, replacing insulation, ripping up flooring, replacing electrical systems, throwing away furniture, fighting mold, and hoping the foundation was not damaged underneath it all. That is why a house raised 6, 8, or 10 feet in the air can look insane right up until the moment it does not. When the water rises, the normal house starts losing rooms. The raised house starts losing only the empty space underneath, and that is a massive difference. The water is not trying to break in. This is the part most people miss. A raised house is not just protected because it is higher, it is protected because it is more honest about what floodwater is going to do. When water hits a solid wall, it pushes. When enough water builds up on one side of that wall, the pressure becomes serious. Now add moving water. Now add waves. Now add debris floating through the neighborhood. A trash can becomes a projectile. A loose dock becomes a projectile. A piece of somebody else's fence becomes a projectile. A car can become a projectile. And suddenly, the bottom of the home is getting hit by water from every direction. If the house has a closed ground floor, all of that pressure has something to push against. The water does not need to be dramatic. It just needs enough force in the wrong place. A garage wall can crack, a door can fail, a window can break, and the second the water gets in, the pressure changes again. That is why the lower levels of elevated homes are often left open. The floodwater can pass underneath. The water does not get trapped on one side. The building is not acting like a giant dam made out of living room walls. It is letting the flood move through the property instead of forcing the whole house to stop it. That is the weird logic behind those tall columns. The house is not trying to beat the flood. It is trying not to be in the flood's way. Why they are so high? Not every raised house in Louisiana is built to the same height. Some are only a few feet above ground. Some look like they are standing on stilts. Some are so high that the stairs look like they belong on a beach lifeguard tower. That height is not supposed to be random. It is based on the risk around that specific property. Builders and local officials look at flood maps, expected flood levels, the type of flood risk, and the elevation of the land itself. The important question is basically this: how high could the water get here during a major flood? If the answer is 3 feet, then putting the living floor 1 foot above the ground is not going to save anything. If the answer is 8 feet, the house needs to be above that danger zone. And in a lot of places, builders do not stop at the exact number. They build higher. That extra height is called freeboard. It is basically a safety margin. Because flood predictions are not a promise. A map can tell you the expected flood level. It cannot promise that the next storm will be polite enough to stop there. That is why two houses on the same street can look completely different. One may be on an older foundation built decades ago. One may have been rebuilt after a flood. One may be outside a strict flood zone. One may have been required to meet newer rules. One owner may have lifted the house after getting destroyed once. And one homeowner may be looking at their neighbor's raised house every hurricane season wondering if they should have done the same thing. There are parts of Louisiana where the state recommends elevation as a major flood risk strategy. For projected 100-year flood depths between 3 and 14 feet, raising the living floor can make sense. Past that point, the conversation gets even darker. Because if a house would need to be lifted more than 14 feet to stay above the expected water, it may be more realistic to move out of the highest risk area entirely. That is when a house stops being a building problem. It becomes a land problem. The columns are doing way more than you think. When you see a house sitting high above water, the first thing you notice is the empty space. But the real story is hidden inside those columns. Those supports have to carry the entire house: the roof, the walls, the furniture, the people, the plumbing, the air conditioning equipment, every heavy thing inside. And they have to do it while being exposed to wind, water, erosion, and sometimes impacts from debris. That is why these are not just random wooden posts stuck into the mud. A properly elevated flood-resistant home may use concrete columns, deep piles, piers, posts, or another engineered foundation system. The exact design depends on the soil, the flood zone, how close the property is to open water, how much wave action it can face, and what local rules require. A calm inland flood is one thing. Coastal storm surge is a completely different animal. In a coastal area, waves can smash into the lower part of a building. Water can tear away soil around the foundation. That process is called scour, and it is one of the reasons those supports need to be properly designed and embedded, because it does not matter how high a house is if the flood tears away the ground holding it up. That is the nightmare version. The home survives the water level, but the foundation loses the soil it depended on. So the house is not simply being held above the flood, it is being anchored against the flood, and it is also being anchored against hurricanes. That creates a weird problem. You raise a house high enough to avoid water, but now you have made it taller, and a taller house gives wind more to push against. So Louisiana homes have to deal with two forces that want opposite things. Water wants to destroy the bottom. Wind wants to tear apart the top. The answer is not one magical feature. It is an entire system. The foundation, the piers, the framing, the straps, the bolts, the roof connections, the windows, the mechanical equipment, the stairs, everything has to work together. Because a raised house is not just a normal house on longer legs, it is a house designed around the fact that the ground can become dangerous. The area under the house is a trap. This is where homeowners get tempted. You have all that space underneath. It is shaded. It is dry most of the year. It is perfect for parking, perfect for storage, perfect for a workshop, perfect for a little bonus room. And that is exactly why people can accidentally ruin the whole point of an elevated home. Because the space under the house feels usable until the day it is not. If someone encloses that lower area with regular walls, finishes it like a normal room, and fills it with expensive stuff, they have created a giant flood target. They have turned the safety feature back into a weak spot. The lower enclosure has to be treated differently from the living floor above it. In flood-prone areas, systems may be designed so water can enter and exit instead of building up pressure against solid walls. Some lower walls are designed to break away in major coastal flooding rather than rip the entire house apart. That sounds insane. Imagine paying for a wall that is supposed to fail, but that wall is cheaper to replace than the entire structure above it. That is the same logic as a crumple zone in a car. You let one part take the hit so the important part has a better chance of surviving. The car parked below the house is also a little misleading. Yes, people park under raised homes all the time. It is convenient. It makes the property feel less strange, but the car is not protected just because it is underneath the house. If floodwater is high enough, the car can still be ruined. That lower space is designed to protect the home, not to turn a flood into free covered parking. And honestly, that is what makes these homes so fascinating. The house looks like it has a giant garage, but it is not really a garage in the way people think of one. It is a flood gap, a space built into the architecture because water needs somewhere to go. Why Louisiana has been building this way for so long, these homes were not invented by modern flood maps. Long before people had digital elevation certificates and hurricane models, people building in Louisiana already understood that low land and water were a bad combination. You can see versions of raised construction in older southern homes, Creole cottages, coastal homes, and rural houses across the region. The details changed depending on the place. Some were lifted to handle wet ground, some helped with ventilation in hot, humid weather, some made room for storage or animals. Some were lifted because people had watched water move through the landscape for generations and knew better than to put everything directly on the ground. That local knowledge matters because old houses were built by people who were not trying to win an architecture award. They were trying to keep a house working through heat, rain, insects, humidity, and floods. But modern Louisiana has made the problem even more complicated. Homes are larger. More people live in flood-prone areas. More valuable equipment sits at ground level. Cars are more expensive. Appliances are more expensive. Repair costs are higher. And once a neighborhood becomes built out, water has fewer places to spread naturally. A field can absorb or hold water differently than a subdivision full of driveways, roads, roofs, and parking lots. So the old raised house idea has gone from a regional building style to something much more serious. It has become part of a bigger survival strategy, not a guarantee, not a magic force field, but a way of giving the house a better chance. The moment people realize why the house is high, the reason raised homes make sense is not obvious on a sunny day. On a sunny day, they can look inconvenient. You have stairs, you have to carry groceries up, you have to think about older family members, you have to design around accessibility, you may have to build ramps or lifts. The underneath area can feel awkward. You may have a beautiful house, but the front entrance starts 10 feet above the driveway. That is not the dream most people have when they picture a home. Then the flood comes, and the whole property gets judged by one question: where did the water stop? For a house on a slab, that question can be devastating. If the water crossed the threshold, it may have crossed every threshold inside the house too. But for the elevated home, the water can rise across the yard, swallow the bottom of the columns, reach the car, reach the stairs, and still not enter the living space. That is the moment the weird architecture stops looking weird. A family may be watching a street disappear underwater, their neighbors may be carrying furniture outside, and their own home is sitting above it all. Not untouched, not completely safe, but still standing above the level where most of the damage happens. That height becomes everything. The price of getting out of the way. Of course, you do not get this protection for free. Raising a home is expensive. Building high from the beginning costs more than pouring a slab close to the ground. Retrofitting an existing house can be even more complicated. The home may need to be lifted with hydraulic jacks. Utilities have to be disconnected. The structure may need temporary support. New foundations, piers, stairs, plumbing connections, electrical systems, and access routes may all be needed. And then there is the part nobody wants to think about. You still have to live there afterward. A high home means climbing stairs every day. It can mean expensive ramps or elevators. It can mean trying to get furniture upstairs through a space that was never designed for it. It can mean a first floor that is no longer easy for someone with limited mobility to reach. It can mean insurance, permits, engineering reports, and inspections before the job even starts. So why do it? Because the alternative can be much worse. Louisiana recovery programs have rebuilt some damaged homes with elevated pier and beam foundations, often starting at around 3 feet unless a local rule requires more. For a family that has already watched their home flood, the raised version is not just a design choice. It is a way to avoid living through the same disaster twice, and that is where the economics become brutal. The cost to raise a home is painful, but the cost of repeatedly rebuilding the inside of a flooded house can be worse. Not just money, time, stress, lost possessions, displacement, living in a hotel, fighting insurance, watching the next storm forecast, and realizing the same thing could happen again. At some point, the tall house starts looking less like an expensive upgrade and more like the only rational move. Why they cannot just build a huge wall? The obvious question is, why not build a giant levee around every house, or a massive concrete wall, or a perfectly sealed ground floor? Why make people climb a staircase forever when you could just keep the water out? Because water is not that easy. A small wall may protect against a small flood, but water can go around it, under it, over it, through a weak point, and if the water stays outside while the entire neighborhood is underwater, pressure keeps building against that barrier. Then there is rain falling inside the protected area, then drainage systems backing up, then pumps that need power during a storm. Then the wall becomes one more thing that has to work perfectly while everything else is failing. At the scale of a single house, elevation is often the simpler strategy. Instead of demanding that the water stay away forever, you move the living space above where the water is expected to reach. It is not flashy. It does not look futuristic. It just works with the reality of the landscape, and that is why these homes can feel so different from normal American houses. Most homes are built as if the ground is permanent. Louisiana's raised homes are built as if the ground can temporarily disappear. The future of the floating house. The strange part is that raised homes may become more common, not less. Not every Louisiana home needs to be 10 feet in the air, and raising a house is not a solution for every location. Some places are too risky, some homes are too hard to lift, some families cannot afford the project, some properties would need so much height that living there stops making sense. But in areas where flooding is a fact of life, the idea is becoming harder to ignore. A raised home does not stop the road from flooding. It does not stop the power from going out. It does not stop a hurricane from ripping apart a weak roof. It does not save the car underneath. And it does not make the water disappear. What it does is create one protected line, the living floor, the place where people sleep, the place where the electrical system is supposed to stay dry, the place where the house keeps being a house. Everything below that line is allowed to lose. And that is the real reason these homes look like they are floating. They are not trying to float above Louisiana. They are trying to survive in it. So the next time you see a colorful house sitting high above a flooded street, do not think somebody forgot to build the first floor. That empty level is the first floor. It is just a first floor designed for water. And in Louisiana, that can be the difference between a flood destroying a home and a flood simply passing underneath it.